WFYI podcasts are made possible by Bloomington, Indiana, an American college town offering experiences like indulging in grub at Nick's English Hut, taking a stroll along Kirkwood Avenue, feeling the history and magic of Assembly Hall, and providing the chance to feel like a college kid again. Plan your trip at visitbloomington.com.
We're going to take a trip right now. Like we always do about this time.
This is a journey into sound. Break it down.
I'm Kyle Long, and you're listening to Cultural Manifesto. On this week's show, we'll celebrate Pride Month by exploring the work of two historically significant Indiana LGBTQ+ musicians. Up first, I'll speak with Lee Weaver of the Indianapolis synth-rock band Software. During the 1980s, Software played a crucial role in the lesbian music scene of central Indiana. Lee is now a non-binary trans person, but at that time, Lee identified as a lesbian woman.
Everybody kind of circled around the music. The big gatherings of lesbians were music festivals.
And on the second half of the show, author Tyler Alpern will join me to discuss the life and music of Bruz Fletcher. The Indianapolis-born songwriter was a pioneer of LGBTQ+ music during the 1930s.
His work is so filled with joy and humor, and that's the thing that I think he would want to be remembered for, not the tragedies.
In just a moment, we'll listen back to my 2021 interview with Lee Weaver. But first, let's hear a classic track from Software. Off their self-titled 1984 cassette, this is Plastic World. That was Software with Plastic World. I spoke with the band's keyboardist and co-founder, Lee Weaver, in 2021. Let's join our conversation as I ask Lee about the legacy of Software in the Indianapolis music scene. Why do you think this music has not gained the prominence of some of the, say, punk bands that came around that time, like Dow Jones and the Industrials and the Zero Boys and groups of that era? Why do you think this has kind of been under the radar for someone like me for so long?
I think the thing is it's hard to imagine what it was like back then. The gender divide was huge. So that was a problem. You know, we'd walk into IRC or one of the music stores of that day, and nobody would wait on us. They would think we were somebody's girlfriend, right? I don't think I ever looked like anybody's girlfriend, but apparently that was the thing. The other thing is we played all original music, which you couldn't. You just couldn't back then. Maybe if you were punk, you could play originals. It was very hard to find venues. So I think the fact that we were just so intent on being ourselves, it really worked against us. And women were not taken seriously in music back then. You had very few people, you know, maybe Nancy Wilson of Heart, some other people who were thought of as musicians. But mostly women in rock and roll were singers. So I think that the two things are, you didn't hear about us because we're not on much, because we played all original music. And the other thing is that we were women. And that's just was a tough sell back then.
Well, Lee, I want to get into the genesis of how this band came together and all that stuff. But first, I do want to talk about your early years. And you told me before we got started here today that you were introduced to computers at an early age, right?
I was introduced by my dad was using computers, the large mainframes that took up so much space. He was using those for work. So he was bringing home the giant terminals in the late 60s when I was just a kid. And we'd just sit down in the kitchen and plug the phone into it. And it was, there was no screen or anything. It was just a giant teletype thing. And just sit there for hours and play, learn basic programming. So I was never... my head started thinking about everything that way earlier. It was easy to go into synths and go into engineering because I wasn't afraid of machines and that kind of stuff. I actually kind of dug them because they were, boys did that. And if there was anything I wanted to be like, it was a boy back then. So.
And this was in the late 1960s, right?
Late 60s, yeah.
Yeah. And, on that theme, it might make sense to put these different periods in your life in context, right?
Yeah.
We're going to be talking a lot about a time in your life when you identified as a woman. You were known as Marg Herder at that time and identified as a woman. You're now known as Lee Isaac Weaver and identify as a non-binary person, right?
Correct, yes.
What would you like to share with our listeners about that transition in your life? Yeah.
Oh, there's a lot I could go into with that. I did really enjoy... if enjoy is the right word for that time, being a lesbian feminist back in the 70s and more of the 80s and 90s. It was a very interesting community, very rich culturally, and it's not. I think probably lesbianism and that kind of thing has gone mainstream, kind of. So the specific cultural attachments that we had back then are not really around, but it was a neat time and a neat time of the feminist awakening. I feel extremely privileged to have been a part of that. It was interesting at the time because I've always had the sense of myself as more of a male person, but there was no example of that in the 60s. So, there was this word tomboy that applied to people. And so I kind of understood that to be me, but it was extremely frustrating in that there were a lot of rules, gender-based rules back then. Dress code where I had to wear dresses to school. Even when I was in high school, girls couldn't take shop or anything, and we had to take home ec. So I had to sew my little jumper and be in the fashion show, which was horrific, but something I've tried to block out of my head. But I grew very attached to that community, and even after being trans became a thing, it was difficult to decide to make any kind of change because I knew I would lose that community. Not that it's any kind of specific thing, but lesbians I identify as women, especially with second wave feminism, of which I was a part. There's a lot of kind of transphobic sentiment in that. There was a lot of separatism at the time. So it was a very difficult decision for me to transition. And I've just made that decision about 3 or 4 years ago. So it's a land of discovery for me, bred as male now. And even though my driver's license has an X on it for, being non-binary, most everybody I encounter who doesn't know me thinks of me as male, yet everybody who's known me all my life, who's my age and older, doesn't really get the whole concept of non-binary. The younger kids totally understand it, but it's really hard for a lot of people my age to adjust to using the right pronouns. So it's a very interesting state where at any given time, if I'm out in the world, I'm he, and dealt with and addressed as if I was a guy. And when I'm around the people I know, I'm called she and addressed and dealt with as if I were a female person. It's a very interesting thing, a topic for a whole show in and of itself, I'm sure.
Caught in the middle of some task, squeezed, not in control and not at ease, confused.
Yeah, I'm curious about the physical spaces in Indianapolis that existed at that time that your group was able to kind of thrive in. You mentioned earlier that your music was sold at Dreams and Swords, a feminist bookstore. There was also a club you played in, which has most recently been, I think, Lockerbie Pub.
Labrys,
yeah. That was a feminist nightclub. Tell me about the physical spaces that Software kind of existed in here in Indianapolis. You also played at the National Women's Music Festival in Bloomington.
We did.
Yeah, tell me about those spaces at that time.
So when I started playing music out before we formed Software, played at Labrys several times. Mary Byrne owned that club, and it was the spot for music, national women's music people, which for those that don't know, women's music is like code word for lesbian music at the time. So when there was a whole national circuit, national performers, and it was everybody kind of circled around the music. The big gatherings of lesbians were music festivals. So there was the Michigan Women's Music Festival, which is kind of famous. Everybody would go to that, and the main thing of there were workshops on all kinds of different topics happening, and there was a spiritual expression that was unique to lesbian feminism called Dianic Wicca, kind of the state religion of the lesbian feminists. But the whole thing was about music. There were stages going all the different times. And so Labrys was one of those venues across the country. Mary was a promoter who would bring in the more national known musicians. They'd play there. Local people like me would play there. Women's music at the time was Holly Near and some of these people, very folk-oriented, sometimes instrumentalists, a little bit of jazz, but not rock. Rock was bad, rock was boys, no, we don't want rock. So when we came into the National Women's Music Festival, there were people that were like, they just didn't think we should be there. There were people who wouldn't go to the show because it was rock. When we would sit in big gatherings with the other musicians that were there, we were not always in sync with the way they were thinking. It was very limited. We weren't really interested in adding top 40 to our repertoire. We had a lot of fun with our songs, and that's what we wanted to do. So that's what we did. It wasn't, fiscally the most responsible thing to do at that time, but it's what we did.
Do you think we're reaching a time where software makes sense? And I feel like this music could have a strong life of its own now. Do you feel like we're in a time now where this music makes sense with people?
Well, if one thing has happened over 40 years, it's the diversification of music in every conceivable way. You used to have a few music companies that were, selling 99% of the music that was around. Now, you still have the big companies, but you have all these other avenues to reach people, all these different distribution things. I mean, when MP3.com first came out, I thought, oh my God, this is a whole new thing. All of a sudden people from all over are hearing my music, and I have a way to get directly to them without a gatekeeper. Well, you have no gatekeepers. So, yeah, I think it makes things more relevant. Whether or not one has the energy to pursue it, and social media these days, which is really the avenue you have to pursue, takes a great deal more energy than I have because of the strife and discord. I have a very difficult time looking at that in our country, and you can't really look at social media without being struck by that. It's so disheartening and disappointing to me. But I think for people who are doing weird stuff, like we were kind of doing weird stuff, this is the time to do it. So there is a chance now. So I'm heartened for, people who are younger with all the energy that are trying to do something really unusual. It's very heartening to see that that's a possibility.
I'm Kyle Long, and you're listening to a special Pride Month edition of Cultural Manifesto. We've been listening back to my 2021 interview with Lee Weaver of Software. Let's hear one more track from Software. Off their 1985 cassette, Future Is Now. This is Trust in Me. Cultural Manifesto will return after this short break.
WFYI podcasts are made possible by Bloomington, Indiana, an American college town offering experiences like indulging in grub at Nick's English Hut, taking a stroll along Kirkwood Avenue, feeling the history and magic of Assembly Hall, and providing the chance to feel like a college kid again. Plan your trip at visitbloomington.com.
I'm Kyle Long, and you're listening to Cultural Manifesto. For the remainder of this week's show, we'll explore the life and music of the Indiana songwriter Bruz Fletcher, a pioneer of LGBTQ plus music during the 1930s. Bruz Fletcher's life was filled with extraordinary luxury and unrelenting tragedy. He was born into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Indiana. While his music was full of humor and joy, misfortune seemed to follow Bruz Fletcher. He took his own life in 1941 at the age of 34. In just a moment, author Tyler Alpern will join me to discuss his 2010 biography, Bruz Fletcher, Camped, Tramped, and a Riotous Vamp. But first, let's listen to one of Bruz Fletcher's best-known songs, Drunk with Love.
I'd never have thought this could happen to me, but it has, and I'm here for the whole world to see. I'm drunk with love, my body aches. Just one shot, that's all it takes to make me cry and tell you why. I'm drunk, dead drunk with love.
That was Bruz Fletcher performing Drunk with Love. And I'm joined now by Tyler Alpern, author of the 2010 book Bruz Fletcher, Camped, Tramped, and a Riotous Vamp. Like Bruz Fletcher, Alpern grew up in Indianapolis. He currently lives in Boulder, Colorado. We spoke via Zoom. Let's join our conversation. Tyler, thank you so much for taking time to do this today. I've been looking forward to talking to you and learning more about the life of Bruz Fletcher and your interest in his work. So thank you.
It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm really impressed that you knew how to pronounce his name.
Bruz Fletcher had a dramatic life, to say the least. At times, his life was filled with extreme wealth and luxury and opulence. At times, his life was filled with unimaginable tragedy and pain. He was born in 1906 to one of the wealthiest and most historic Indiana families. Everyone who grows up in Indianapolis knows Fletcher Place neighborhood, or there's even a coffee shop named after his great-great-uncle.
Great.
He spent part of his childhood in Laurel Hall, an extravagant mansion and estate his father built around 1916. But during the 1920s, Bruz Fletcher's family and world just completely shattered in tragedy. First of all, what can you share with us about Bruz Fletcher's early life in Indiana, some of the good things and some of the positive experiences he had as a kid?
You are correct. He was born into this very wealthy family who had the Fletcher Bank, but they also were, the first investors in the Speedway, and also raised racehorses. One of Bruz Fletcher's father's horses, Peter the Great, is one of only two direct lines of trotting horses that we have today. So they had parties at Laurel Hall that were so big they used washing machines, it said, to mix the cocktails for the parties. And I think that they were a fun, lively bunch, not bankers we think of as being as stereotypically conservative as far as, you don't want a wild party person playing around with your money, right? So that they have a reputation that they have to maintain. But I think that the Fletchers broke the mold on that.
And Tyler, as I alluded to, there was also incredible tragedy in the Fletcher family. The family lost its fortune during the 1920s, and there was a horrific double suicide that occurred in the family. What can you share with us about sort of the extreme tragedy that Bruz Fletcher lived through during this time?
Well, so you mentioned the double suicide. What happened was Fletcher's father was in Chicago on business, and he was home from boarding school. So he's around 13 years old or something. It's spring break. And his mother, who is in a lot of pain because she has cancer, finally decides to end her life. And she decides to end her life by drinking poison. So she goes to her beautiful bedroom and she gets, the glass of poison and lies down in her bed and sips from the poison. And her mother, who was visiting, finds her dead in her bed and is so overcome, she grabs the poison thinking it's just a glass of water. Her mouth suddenly goes dry. And so she drinks the poison unknowing that she's just killed herself. And there's a butler in the house, and Bruz, they're the only two men at home at the time. And the butler finds the bodies. And I think that Bruz never really liked butlers anymore. He doesn't paint them very favorably in his songs or in his novels. He's always suspicious of butlers. I think it comes back to that. But then shortly after that, he himself tries to commit suicide. When I was doing the research and there was so little, there was nothing out there. So I, from the back of one of his record covers, it mentioned the boarding school he went to in Pennsylvania. So I wrote to them and I was very curious. I said, this was in 1919, but one of your students, I'm curious about, do you still have records? And they said, well, we do, but they're off-site. We'll have to get back to you on that. And so she writes me back and says, oh, yes, I did find something. We expelled him because he shot himself. And every time I tried to research something about him, it only raised more questions. It never answered a question.
Summer, winter, fall, I adore them all. But in April or in May, a day is born that makes me say, I want to sing because it's spring in Manhattan. I'm glad to be alive.
Eventually, he leaves Indiana. Do we know what year he left Indiana and what were the circumstances? I can imagine he'd want to have some separation between himself and these tragic events he experienced here. Do we know what the circumstances were?
He left in 1924 with his father and sister. His sister was even more eccentric than anybody else in the family. And they moved to California when Fletcher Sr. declared bankruptcy and lost Laurel Hall.
Eventually, he becomes a star in the Los Angeles nightclub scene. Did he immediately start performing? What was his pathway to becoming the songwriter and performer we remember him for being today?
He started in vaudeville. And so he was writing songs for some very big stars of the day, silent screen stars. And they would have acts that they would travel around the country. And then as it transitioned a few years later into making sound movies, and these women didn't know what they were going to do, and they were sort of proving their chops, that they did have voices. He wrote not only songs, but entire acts for them, and he would perform on stage. He would be the pianist while they performed the songs that he wrote, and they would be wearing the gowns that his lover, Casey Roberts, designed for them. So he brought his boyfriend along, and they were in business together, taking silent screen stars and giving them a second career. And so that's how he got on stage, and first creating songs and music for other people, and then for himself.
The story of a young girl who had everything it takes and took everything there was to be had. It was really incredible the way she got around the largest obstacles. Why, in Palm Beach, she was swept from the breakers right into Bradley's, where she lit on the green among 1,000 other chippies. But let me recede and describe her with more inversion. She's a nympho, dipso, egomaniac, a bundle of good, clean fun, unsquelchable, insatiable, pushover Amy.
And Tyler, you mentioned his partner, Casey Roberts, and you've written about their relationship and referred to them as one of the few openly gay couples living a very public life at that time. Tell me about that aspect of Bruz Fletcher's life. Did that create any trouble for him during that time period, being so out and open?
Yes. Of course, everything was done in a coded way. They were out and open. Everybody knew, but it was also, when you read about them in the newspaper, like attending a party, it, doesn't say Bruz and Casey went to this party. Their names are both listed as the guests. They lived together in Hollywood, but they had, I think, separate bedrooms for show. But there are articles about how their house was a salon for artists, and all sorts of writers and dancers and musicians and actors would come for their evening soirees. And then they left California after Bruz's sister died under bizarre and tragic circumstances, and moved to Newport, Rhode Island, where they did the same thing. And they held salons, and they wrote articles in the paper about each other's work and welcomed people into their home. It was known that they were living together. It was put in the paper. But in all of those places, they shared a residence, and it's all in the press about what they were doing in their residence and the collaborations that they were doing.
There's nothing so gay as a stinking cafe, a club where the night mites rally. There's nothing so vicious or costly pernicious as the life we all lead in the alley. For birthdays and weddings and airing our beddings, the home is no longer a boon. A private pleasure or vex we now make public as sex. The salon of today's the saloon.
During the time that Bruz was active as a songwriter, there was an artistic movement, I don't know how else to refer to it, known as the pansy craze. Was Bruz a part of this movement, and how can you kind of explain this term, the pansy craze?
Yes, he is lumped into the pansy craze. The pansy craze was a time when it was a sort of pre-code Hollywood, so that you could get away with on screen before there was these ratings and dialing in things. So gay performers were a little more prominent. There could be drag queens in movies. Soon afterwards, you couldn't even go on stage in drag, and you certainly couldn't be in public in drag in the 1930s, late 30s. But there was a brief moment before the code when gay performers could be a little more out. And then Bruz, even when the pansy craze ended, he was able to still perform and be fairly out because his nightclub was in a very small part of LA on Sunset Boulevard, known as the Sunset Strip, which is outside of LA County, and so wasn't under the jurisdiction of the LA County Sheriff, and they were allowed to perform work, and gay men could come together. It's illegal for more than 3 gay men to be in the same room at this time in LA, but on the Sunset Strip, you could be more out and open. And his songs and the way that he performed at a very fast clip, most people didn't even understand what he was saying, and it was just sort of amusing, ha-ha. And before you could really get the joke or the double entendre of what he meant, we were, 3 jokes down. So that was a way, too, that he was able to attract a crowd that was not just gay, but was gay-friendly, and so it was not just a gay bar. It was very mixed, but a place that was comfortable for one to be themselves if they were gay.
Till one morning early she saw Hilly Brown depart. The older folk was angry. They decided on recourse. They hired a slick attorney, and they said with all their force, "Oh, we'll bill Hilly, yes, we'll bill Hilly for the damage what he done to little Nell, our Nell. She's an ill filly, yes, an ill filly, for he done his damage and he done it well."
He eventually had a chance to record his original songs. I think he recorded around 20 songs during the 1930s. And this is not your typical pop music from that era. These are very sophisticated songs. Lyrically, the lyrics are very daring. What can you tell us about Bruz's work as a recording artist, and how did he get these unique and risque songs recorded during this time?
Well, he recorded for the Liberty Music Shop, which recorded a lot of New York cabaret artists. And so that's how he got this recording contract. And at that time, a lot of record shops sold work under the counter, which means that, these were things that were a little more risque. And if you knew about them, you could ask for them. So by word of mouth. And Bruz Fletcher was not the only person who had recordings in this vein or in this style. His had more double entendres and were a little more risque, but it was very similar to the work of a man, Dwight Fisk, or of a wonderful lesbian performer, Madame Spivey, who also had her own nightclub in New York, and that's a whole other legendary story.
Is it worth it? For that momentary something to yowl around till neighbors call a cop? Is it worth it? For that momentary something to have 900 kittens call you pop? You've been an awful wildcat, you should welcome a vacation. Just to sit around and brood and think about your operation. I'll give you one more night out to complete your education. Then the sheltered life is good enough for you. I took him to the vet and had his profile bobbed. And when he sat down, he said, "Hell, I've been robbed."
These songs sound so fresh and relevant today. The things that he's writing about are still concerns we have today. Are there a few songs of his that really stand out to you that you'd want to kind of elaborate on or share with our listeners?
Absolutely. Well, his most famous song is Drunk with Love, and that lived on quite a while after his death. It became actually an anthem that you would hear in lesbian bars in the 40s and 50s. If you read accounts of the day, they all mentioned somebody was singing Drunk with Love, whether it was a drag king or whether it was Frances Faye, but you knew you were in a lesbian bar because Drunk with Love was being sung, and it's a terrific song. He wrote Peter Lily Daisy, which he recorded twice, and then the second time he recorded it, he called it It. And that is about a non-binary character, of which, how many things from the 1930s are about non-binary characters? So that's one of my favorites, and it's very clever, and it ends happily. So many stories about people who are outside the mainstream and gay people in the 30s generally end with them dying or something horrible happening. And Peter Lily Daisy is absolutely affirming song. And what's another? I love My Doctor, which is basically a love song that he sings to his doctor. And it's pretty saucy, and the double entendres, you can imagine what they might be.
My doctor, that masterful, medical, miracle man. My doctor, he's got the biggest practice in town. My doctor, he'll pick you up the minute you're down. Rich and poor, black and white, ring his bell all the day and night. Some folks faint at just the sight of my doctor. My doctor, his operation's really a joy. My doctor, with all his instruments you can toy.
Let's take a break from my conversation with Tyler Alpern and listen to another song from Bruz Fletcher. From 1937, this is It, also known as Peter Lily Daisy.
Little Peter Lily Daisy had the doctors in a whirl, for physically it certainly could vex. They simply could not tell if it were boy or girl, for the minute they'd decide, it would quickly change its sex. This unusual ability it plied with great agility. In the space of just 1 second, it would switch. And because it loved to do it, and did when no one knew it, they called it neither he nor she, but much more simply, which.
That was the Indiana songwriter Bruz Fletcher with It, also known as Peter Lily Daisy. My guest this week is Tyler Alpern, author of the biography Bruz Fletcher, Camped, Tramped, and a Riotous Vamp. Let's return to our conversation. We talked about Bruz Fletcher's early life being full of tragedy, and his life came to a tragic end in 1941. What can you share with us about Bruz Fletcher's final years and his tragic end?
He had a number of tragedies that happened in his last years. He was involved in a car crash that when he was driving drunk and he hit some people. Nobody died, but he was sued, and there was legal trouble with that. Very sadly, he and Casey lost their home and all of their pet monkeys in a fire. He was out buying cigarettes, and the whole house burned down to ashes. Casey Roberts, his partner, went through the ashes and found soup cans that had, that's about the only thing that survived. And he cut up those soup cans and made a sculpture out of them that is in if you ever see Ingrid Bergman's first American film, that sculpture of the soup cans is in the background of the dining room in the beautiful home. But it was a tragedy for them to lose everything and have to start again. He eventually loses his job at the Club Bali and sort of wanders around New York for a while. He comes back to Los Angeles in the fall before he commits suicide. Some of his colorful friends were very concerned about him, and there are some telegrams that still exist that talk about, what's going on with him. But he does find his way back to California, and it's said in the press, despondent over having lost his job, but it's far more complicated than that. He commits suicide by asphyxiating himself in the garage of Jack Snowden, who was the person who built that great house on Franklin, that Mayan house that they say the Black Dahlia was killed at. That's not the house where Bruz committed suicide, but the owner had since moved into another house, and that's where Bruz committed suicide.
His death made national news, correct? I know it was written about here in Indianapolis. What sort of impact did his death have culturally?
I don't know if there was any cultural impact other than, another sad story about a gay man dying young and not being accepted. I think that for years in, certainly the Hollywood's presentation of who gay people were, that was a true gay Hollywood story. And then the gay Hollywood stories that we see until the 1990s, the 2000s, where the gay characters don't die, it's just part of that coloring.
Just the simple things are all I want. The things they say are free, not ornate or great, for I've a way to make them pay for me. I want a shack across the track with a front door and a back, so that I can get away if necessary.
You've played a huge role in keeping the music and story of Bruz Fletcher alive. You wrote a book, Bruz Fletcher, Camped, Tramped, and a Riotous Vamp. I believe you were involved in compiling the anthology CD, Drunk with Love. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes.
Yes, those were taken from all of my recordings. It took a long time to collect his records. Some of them I've only found once in 20-some years.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you also maintain a website, tyleralpern.com, where you share information and photos about Bruz Fletcher. When did you find out about his story, and what spoke to you so deeply about his life and art that you've invested so much of your own life into maintaining his story and educating people about his work?
If I had known how much work it was going to take to uncover his story, I would have never done it to begin with. I'm the biographer of another gay singer, Frances Faye, and she, as I mentioned earlier, Drunk with Love was one of her signature songs. And everybody was always curious, what is Drunk with Love? Where did it come from? If you look at the different record labels of the different years it was reissued or issued, she recorded it a couple of times. It either said songwriter unknown, songwriter is Queenie Smith, songwriter is Joyce Bryant, songwriter is Bruz Fletcher, which is a really weird name. The singer Peter Allen was desperate to find the sheet music for this song and the story behind it. So finally, I just decided, okay, I'm going to try to figure out where this song came from. What is a Bruz Fletcher? And every time I did some research to answer a question, it only led to more questions. Like when I wrote to his school to find out, do you know anything about this person? Oh, yeah, he killed himself. Or I found out about his mother, or just anything. It only yields more questions, never any answers. And it just became fascinating. And I worked with a librarian in Indianapolis, Georgia Cravey, and we just, every puzzle piece we uncovered just revealed more of the picture. And it was just it was giddy excitement, diving in deep to find out whatever we could.
Did the fact that you were from Indianapolis and he grew up here, did that have any special meaning for you at all?
Of course it did. It absolutely did. I was traumatized as a kid when we left Indiana, and it's so distant to me now that it was a reaching back to touch a part of me that feels long gone.
Yeah. Without your intervention, I would never have known who this man was. None of this would have happened. So none of this work would have been documented as it has. So thank you for all your work in maintaining his story and music. And I'm curious, do you think his life and work has received the attention it deserves up to this point?
Definitely not. Someday somebody's got to make a movie about his story and his music, because it is so captures not only the 1930s, but kind of in the same way that Shakespeare captures the human spirit and human nature. There's just so much truth in the characters that he created. They're very special. They're very rare. And I think that there's more to come on the Bruz front.
Any final thoughts you want to share, Tyler, on the life and work of Bruz Fletcher?
I just think that it's really important that his work is so filled with joy and humor and that's the thing that I think he would want to be remembered for, not the tragedies.
Well said. Thank you, Tyler.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I really appreciate your interest in his story.
Thank you for all your work documenting the story and keeping the music alive. I know compiling that CD alone sounds like it was an unbelievable task, so thank you.
I've lost all my friends, lost all my pride. I've lost all my money, it's true. I've given up everything, really I've tried to do just the best that I knew. I'd never have thought this could happen to me, but it has, and I'm here for the whole world to see.
I've been speaking with the writer and researcher Tyler Alpern, author of the biography Bruz Fletcher, Camped, Tramped, and a Riotous Vamp. You can find more information about Bruz Fletcher at Tyler's website, tyleralpern.com. That's all the time we have for this week. Check out the Cultural Manifesto podcast at WFYI.org or wherever you listen to podcasts. Cultural Manifesto is hosted and produced by me, Kyle Long. Thank you for listening.
WFYI podcasts are made possible by Bloomington, Indiana, an American college town offering experiences like indulging in grub at Nick's English Hut, taking a stroll along Kirkwood Avenue, feeling the history and magic of Assembly Hall, and providing the chance to feel like a college kid again. Plan your trip at visitbloomington.com.